Friends, if you want to watch the thrilling and action-packed movie Apocalypse in the Tropics 2025 in English, then make sure to like this video. If you are visiting our channel for the very first time, don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss any exciting updates. Friends, in today's video the movie we are going to talk about is titled Apocalypse in the Tropics 2025. We will dive deep into what this movie is about, where you can watch it, and all the exciting and surprising facts surrounding it. In this video I am going to share with you complete information about which OTT platform or which satellite channel will showcase this film. We will also explore the technical side of the film, including the cinematography, sound design, special effects, pre-production, filming, post-production, budget, and box office performance. Alongside that we will also talk about the storyline of the movie, and I will give you a quick review of the story to keep you engaged. We will discuss in detail about the cast, which actor has played which role, how the performances stand out, and what makes this film such a unique cinematic experience. Friends, stay with me till the very end of this video because I promise you it will be worth it. So let's not wait any longer and begin our journey into the world of Apocalypse in the Tropics 2025. Apocalypse in the Tropics 2025 opens with a Sunsplash tourist video that abruptly glitches into emergency sirens, a perfect bait and switch that sets the film's rhythm of paradise colliding with panic. Then it rewinds 48 hours to track three threads that keep crisscrossing like storm bands. Dr. Maya Rios, a climate systems modeler flown in to audit a controversial geoengineering array. Jonah Vale, a burned-out ex-Coast Guard skipper running supply runs between the islands. And Ronnie, a pirate radio host whose late-night broadcasts stitch the archipelago's communities together. The story plays with time and perspective from the jump. Drone shots freeze into weather maps. Ronnie's broadcasts jump forward to tease events we haven't seen yet, and a kid's handheld footage inserts grainy timestamps that later line up with bigger reveals. The inciting event is gorgeous and horrifying, a neon red tide glowing under a carnival fireworks show, followed by a sudden ring of cyclones knitting themselves into a stationary gyre that cages the islands, forcing the characters into a bottle episode world as planes can't land and ships can't approach. The first big turn comes when Maya discovers the storms are feeding on heat plumes from a floating mirror array project meant to deflect sunlight, now malfunctioning after a cost-cutting firmware push by the corporate contractor, and the only access is through a rust-patched service barge Jonah swore never to pilot again. The film then fractures its timeline more boldly. Sequences replay from another angle, radio monologues cut into montage, and what looks like a prophecy from an old fisherman turns out to be Jonah's memory of a near-identical rescue years prior, turning folklore into foreshadowing and making the apocalypse feel like a loop people live through on different scales. Midway through, after a scrappy daytime raid on the mirror array control node that plays like heist cinema with wetsuits and socket wrenches, Maya and Jonah think they've done it by forcing a shutdown, and for a few minutes the skies open, the sea flattens, music returns to the beach bars. Then the supposed victory flips when Ronnie picks up a coded maritime bulletin revealing a salvage clause that auto-boots the mirrors into safe mode, which secretly vents their stored heat into the deep trench, triggering methane upwellings and undersea lightning that turns the water into a crackling minefield, an escalation that reframes the disaster as bureaucratic rather than purely natural. From here the conflict tightens, fuel runs dry, cell towers fail, islanders switch to hand-crank radios, and the film leans into tactile survival details. Rain catchers lashed from billboards, flares fired to clock wind speed, conch shells used as foghorns, while the emotional core sharpens around the trio's fraying trust, especially when Jonah hides that the corporate fixer on the array is his estranged brother, which refracts the macro theme of extraction versus community into a family standoff. The second major turn discovers that the mirror array isn't the only lever. There's a buried thermal facility under the mangroves, a pre-storm pilot project to power resorts, now cavitating the seabed and amplifying the gyre's torque, and it's reachable only through sinkholes that open like trapdoors during king tide. So the climax becomes a delirious, nearly wordless plunge where time collapses entirely. Footage from the kid's camera, Ronnie's voice counting down in a broadcast that seems to arrive from tomorrow, and Maya's models overlaying the cave walls like phosphorescent graffiti. When the characters sabotage the thermal pumps, the movie doesn't deliver a tidy triumph. Instead it cracks the gyre just enough to create a single navigable corridor, a gamble measured in minutes, and the escape sequence plays out as a maritime drum solo with boats slingshotting through the eye while Ronnie narrates routes over a hand-drawn map that keeps smearing in the humidity, the plot literally sweating. Key turning points land not just as spectacle but as emotional beats. Maya choosing imperfect action over perfect modeling, Jonah steering toward a storm he once fled, Ronnie dropping the cool DJ persona to confess fear on air, which cues scattered listeners to answer back, turning a lone broadcast into a chorus. Thematically, the film keeps looping on the idea that apocalypse is not an ending but a pattern we inherit or interrupt. Every repeated shot returns altered. Postcards of beaches now waterlogged. The same mango tree filmed before and after with a line of debris around its trunk marking the storm's height, so the narrative's experiments with time feel like the ocean's rhythm rather than gimmickry. By the final stretch, the story has braided its threads so tightly that perspective becomes communal. What began as 3 separate arcs converges into a moving relay in which characters pass literal and figurative torches, and the last movement rides the uneasy calm that follows a storm, letting the audience sit with both relief and the charged awareness that the tropics are still alive, still beautiful, and still one bad decision away from the next rupture. What makes Apocalypse in the Tropics 2025 hum is how its characters don't just react to storms, they generate weather of their own, and the film maps those fronts with satisfying precision, starting with Dr. Maya Rios, who begins as a razor-sharp climate modeler carrying the armor of professional certainty and the guilt of having once signed off on the Mirror Array's earliest feasibility memo. Her arc isn't a tidy slide from data to daring but a layered unlearning where she keeps trying to control chaos with spreadsheets until repeated field failures force her to author a Messier kind of courage, the kind that trusts community intel and accepts actionable, good enough, over elegant perfection. And the screenplay makes this growth tactile by shifting her dialogue from qualifiers and caveats to clipped, decisive verbs as she starts delegating, improvising tools from junk, and letting the islanders' embodied knowledge correct her models on the fly. Jonah Vale, the ex-Coast Guard skipper, is introduced as a man allergic to second chances, a loner running supply runs like penance, and his reluctance isn't romanticized. It's prickly, defensive, rooted in a botched rescue and a fallout with his brother, the corporate fixer babysitting the array, so his development reads as a staggered dance between fear and duty, punctuated by small, telling choices. Turning the boat back into rougher water for one more pickup, admitting on deck that he was the one who taught his brother the shortcuts, now being exploited, recalibrating his sense of responsibility from saving everyone to saving the ones he can reach, which paradoxically makes him braver. Ronnie, the pirate radio host, is the film's stealth protagonist, a voice that starts as wry commentary and becomes the archipelago's nervous system. Her transformation runs from performance to presence, dropping quips for vulnerability that invites reciprocal courage, and her on-air relationship with listeners, fishermen, nurses, kids with hand cranks, turns the audience into a character as well. A chorus that feeds the plot practical fixes and moral pressure, while off-air she learns to move from signal to action, showing up with bolt cutters, ferrying messages, and finally coordinating the evacuation corridor with a map she keeps redrawing as conditions change. Around them orbit sharp secondaries who deepen the tapestry rather than crowd it. The kid with the handheld who graduates from observer to witness when his footage anchors timelines and his plea gets Jonah to risk the trench. The old fisherman whose folklore frames the island's memory and refracts into Jonah's own past. The corporate brother who isn't a mustache twirler but a survivalist trapped in incentive structures, making the central conflict less hero versus villain than kinship versus compliance. An island medic whose triage tent becomes a truth booth where characters confront what they're willing to lose. Relationships aren't static pairings but evolving circuits. Maya and Jonah learn a professional trust that reads less like romance and more like a pact between specialists. Maya and Ronnie build a feedback loop where models inform routes and routes correct models. Jonah and his brother stage the film's quietest knife fight with words on a catwalk, bargaining over shutdown codes and childhood debts. A scene that reframes every later risk as an answer to the question of whom you're willing to disappoint. Motivation flows from biography into theme. Maya's need to atone without martyrdom, Jonah's need to steer into rather than away from history, Ronnie's need to turn audience into agency, and each pivot they make bends the plot. A confession unlocks a password, a radio plea moves fuel to the right dock, a retracted blame frees a character to take the dive. By the time the storm corridor opens, the film has engineered a communal arc where leadership is temporarily held and then passed along, and every character, even minor ones, gets a beat that registers as growth, not because they become different people but because they finally act like the people they've been rehearsing to be. What makes Apocalypse in the Tropics 2025 so gripping isn't only its storm-lashed set pieces but the way its actors inhabit the chaos with performances that feel raw, lived in, and strangely intimate, as if the cast was stranded with us and not just playing survivors on a screen. The anchor is the actress playing Dr. Maya Rios, who resists the cliché of the scientist-turned-action hero, and instead crafts a layered portrait of a woman whose mind is her first weapon and her last shield. She nails the subtle physicality of someone who spends most of her life behind data, twitchy gestures when forced to improvise, shoulders tightening whenever intuition has to replace calculation, but lets those habits melt in real time as the film forces Maya into muddy, sweat-stained spaces. What really lands is how she conveys authority without bravado. A single clipped line from her, whispered through rain while marking equations on a cargo door, has more charge than any grand speech. Opposite her, the actor embodying Jonah Vale is magnetic in a deliberately unsmooth way. He doesn't lean into rugged charm or stoic heroism, but plays Jonah as a man whose silence is heavy with unspoken wreckage. His eyes do much of the lifting, haunted, cagey, sometimes reckless, and his body language communicates everything from resentment to reluctant loyalty long before the dialogue catches up. There's a moment on deck when he steadies the wheel while staring into storm lightning that could easily have been melodramatic, but the actor grounds it with the tiniest flicker of fear, reminding us this is a man fighting himself as much as the sea. His eventual confrontations with his estranged brother are among the film's highlights, stripped-down exchanges where pauses, breaths, and even side glances feel like weapons sharper than any knife. Then there's the breakout performance, the actress playing Ronnie, the pirate radio host. She steals every scene not by overshadowing the others but by giving the story its heartbeat. Her voice, both on air and off, becomes a character in itself, playful one minute, trembling the next, always laced with the sense that people are listening who desperately need hope. She shifts seamlessly between comic relief and raw confession, delivering some of the film's most emotional punches through nothing more than tone. When she finally lets the mask drop in a broadcast, speaking not as a DJ but as a terrified islander, the moment is electric. You can almost feel the audience inside the film responding alongside the one in the theater. The supporting cast, too, elevate the story rather than fade into the background. The young actor playing the kid with the handheld camera brings a disarming mix of curiosity and courage. His wide-eyed lens becomes our anchor in the madness, and when he finally steps out from behind it, the growth feels earned. The veteran playing the old fisherman turns minimal dialogue into myth, delivering lines with a rhythm that makes them feel carved from folklore. Even the corporate fixer brother, a role that could have slipped into cartoonish villainy, is performed with restraint, his pragmatism coated in frustration, his smirks hiding genuine weariness, which makes his conflict with Jonah sting with realism instead of cliché. What's striking is how well the ensemble functions together. Nobody feels like they're acting in a different film, yet each actor brings a unique texture: quiet strength, jagged guilt, improvisational humor, generational wisdom. The chemistry is less about romance and more about friction and reliance. Watching these characters argue, reconcile, and improvise feels as natural as watching real people forced to make impossible choices. Performances like these don't just carry the film, they ground the spectacle in humanity, ensuring that when the waves crash and the storms rage, we care about who survives not because the script tells us to, but because the actors have convinced us that survival has a face, a voice, and a cost. The director treats the tropics like a pressure cooker and a playground, tuning tone and mood the way a radio operator hunts for a clean frequency. Sunlit postcard textures lure you in, then the film microdoses dread, children laughing off camera while a barometer needle twitches, carnival streamers whipping just out of frame, a tourist drone shot that stalls midair as wind shear hits. From the first bait and switch cold open, vacation promo snap cutting into a siren chorus, the storytelling runs on contrast, always placing the beautiful beside the unsafe so your eye can't relax. The director's smartest choice is making Ronnie's pirate radio broadcasts the film's spine. They're used diegetically as scene glue, as misdirection, as prophecy, and sometimes just as weather. That voiceover doesn't explain, it destabilizes, stitching scenes with fragments that our brains complete a beat later, which keeps momentum high without resorting to exposition dumps. Shot composition is intensely intentional and island literate. Horizons sit a little too low so the sky feels like a lid. When the gyre forms, the horizon tilts 2 degrees and never quite straightens until the corridor sequence, a micro unease you only notice when your stomach does. Close-ups are humid and tactile, salt crust on skin, condensation on radios, knuckles blanching around a wheel, while wide frames are held long enough for you to map the coastline and understand stakes by geography rather than dialogue. The director pulls out split diopter shots to keep foreground fixes and background threats in simultaneous focus, a hand soldering a fuse while, behind it, water climbs the dock ladder rung by rung. Match cuts turn data into weather and back again, a spiral in a model echoes a whirlpool in a sinkhole, a glimmer on a mirror array flips to a fish's eye, making the science feel like part of the ecosystem rather than a lecture beamed in from elsewhere. Pacing breathes like a storm cell. The build is patient and observational, then the middle third snaps into heist timing during the daytime raid on the mirror array node. Crisp blocking, clean axial cuts, no shaky cam laziness, just precise geography that makes every sprint and slide readable. After the fake victory, the film deliberately downshifts into survival rhythms, water collection, hand crank radios, triage lines, so that when the methane upwellings ignite, the acceleration feels earned, a metronome leaping from adagio to presto. The director favors oneers for bodily tasks, hauling a net, aligning a barge, threading a cable through a flooded shaft, so competence reads as choreography. Conversely, dialogue showdowns are edited with air around them. The catwalk confrontation between the brothers weaponizes pauses and echo, cutting not on lines but on glances that fail to land. There's a tactile bias for practical effects. You can feel the drag of real water on actors' limbs and the percussive sting of rain machines. CG augments scale but never replaces physics. Wind is a character. Hair direction and fabric ripple are continuity anchors that help you subconsciously read incoming gusts, which turns the weather into legible action beats. Color grading shifts from lime and coral to bruised teals and iron grays as the gyre tightens, then warms into rust and candlelight whenever community asserts itself. Kitchen tables, generator-lit clinics, a map smeared by sweaty fingertips. The director uses sound as framing as much as picture. Radios crackle at specific frequencies for each island, boat hulls thrum at different pitches depending on cargo, and the score often backs off to let rope creak and palm fronds chatter carry the rhythm. When music does surge, it's built from found percussion, buoy bells, fuel drums, oars against hulls, so the set itself becomes the orchestra. Perspective play is bold but never show-offy. The kids' handheld footage isn't just flavor. The director plants its timestamps early, then later aligns them with drone views to unlock a puzzle beat, giving the audience the pleasure of solving without being told they solved it. A handful of brief aspect ratio compressions appear in subterranean sequences to squeeze the frame the moment oxygen becomes a plot point. The shift is subtle, almost subliminal, but your breath shortens with the image. Transitions are frequently hard-wipe practicals. Door slams, tarp snaps, wave crashes, editing driven by objects rather than software, which keeps the film's kinetic grammar grounded in place. Leadership and community are staged, not stated. Blocking during crisis scenes shows who listens and who acts. Extras lean toward Ronnie's voice, then pivot as Maya sketches a plan on a cargo door, then settle as Jonah nods from the wheelhouse. You learn power dynamics by where people stand, whose hands are free, who is framed by doorways like thresholds they refuse to cross. When the evacuation corridor sequence kicks in, the director turns maritime navigation into a physical map you can read at speed. Drone overs show reef teeth and rip lines. Boat-mounted cams keep the horizon steady while the world tilts, and cutaways to Ronnie's grease pencil map tie it all together, so every swerve registers as a decision, not a special effect. The final beat is staged with a kind of earned restraint, a wide shot that refuses close-ups, letting the environment speak while the characters move through it, small, determined, and vividly human, the director trusting that tone and mood don't need to be announced when they've been engineered into every frame. The cinematography of Apocalypse in the Tropics 2025 doesn't just capture a story, it sculpts one. The camera feels alive, breathing with the storm, shrinking into cramped shelters when fear takes over and opening wide into impossible skies when nature asserts its scale. Angles are chosen like chess moves. Low shots make even a puddle look threatening. Overhead drones reduce desperate boats to flickers of white against bruised water, and handheld close-ups jitter with salt spray so that you can practically feel the sting of seawater on your own skin. There's an intimacy to the framing that makes survival tactile. Sweat beads, rope fibers, and trembling fingers are filmed with the same reverence as panoramic cyclone spirals, reminding us that the human body is part of the landscape. Lighting is weaponized throughout the film. Early scenes bask in golden postcard warmth, the kind of glow you'd expect from a travel ad, and then that same sunlight becomes blinding, almost hostile, as it reflects off rising seas and mirror arrays. Night sequences lean into chiaroscuro, kerosene lamps painting amber pools, headlamps carving frantic circles, lightning bolts freezing entire frames into high-contrast horror stills. The storm itself becomes a light source, flashes timing the rhythm of action, sometimes revealing characters mid-struggle for a fraction of a second and then plunging them back into darkness, forcing the audience to assemble the battle in bursts the way survivors would. Underwater scenes embrace murk and phosphorescence, greenish shafts of light slicing through debris clouds so that swimming feels less like movement and more like tunneling through liquid smoke. Framing is constantly in dialogue with theme. When Maya is boxed in by data and hesitation, she's shot through glass, doorways, or grates that cage her in subtle ways. As she grows into field leadership, the frame expands around her, opening negative space above her head until she seems aligned with the horizon itself. Jonah's shots are often off-center, the horizon tilting slightly as though the camera itself can't trust him, until the climactic steering sequence, where he is finally dead center, storm and sea balanced around him. Ronnie, on the other hand, is framed with speakers, wires, and mics encroaching into the image, visual clutter that transforms into connection as more people start responding. By the time her voice guides the evacuation, the camera frames her in wide angles that emphasize not clutter but reach, her tiny booth visually expanding into the whole island. Visually striking moments abound. The fireworks and red tide sequence that ignites the first act is burned into memory, a wide festival shot that collapses into a handheld sprint as glowing water laps closer, the celebratory sky above mirrored by poisoned fire below. The methane ignition scene is even bolder. Lightning ignites the sea and the camera lingers, not on the explosion, but on stunned faces lit by blue fire reflected in pupils, the scale of disaster conveyed through awe before terror. The evacuation corridor sequence is the crown jewel of tension. The camera alternates between God's eye drone shots that render the boats as fragile dots threading reef channels, and POV shots on deck where waves tower so close the horizon disappears. Cutting between the two collapses grandeur and claustrophobia into one dizzying experience. Even quiet scenes are visually alive. A shot of rain dripping from mango leaves into a bucket carries the same weight as the storm surges, framed in such tight focus that each droplet sounds like a drumbeat of survival. In another, the kids' handheld footage captures a low-angle shot of a fisherman, silhouetted against a bruised purple sky, and the image plays later as prophecy, a homemade myth filmed on accident. These choices elevate the film beyond disaster spectacle and into something almost lyrical. Beauty and menace fuse together until the viewer feels caught in the same contradiction as the characters, marveling at the tropics even as they crumble. The cinematography builds atmosphere through rhythm. Long static takes lull you into calm before whip-pan chaos slams into view. Shaky close-ups mimic adrenaline, then glide out into steadier wide shots as characters regain composure. Horizon lines and water reflections are used like visual leitmotifs, shifting from calm mirrors to fractured mosaics to obliterated chaos as the story itself escalates. By the end, when the corridor opens and the camera pulls wide into a rare stillness, the effect is emotional as much as visual. The audience finally exhales because the lens itself breathes again. The editing of Apocalypse in the Tropics 2025 is like a pulse that rises and falls with the storm itself, and it's that rhythmic quality that keeps the film gripping from start to finish. The flow is never flat or predictable. Instead, it mimics the natural breathing of crisis. Slow inhalations of quiet setup, sharp exhalations of chaos, and then long, uneasy pauses where the audience is forced to sit in the aftermath before the next surge hits. What makes the editing stand out is that it doesn't just stitch scenes together, it constantly shapes how we feel time inside the story. Early on, the pacing is deliberately measured, even deceptively casual. Shots linger on beaches, markets, and radio chatter with just enough overlap between sounds and images to suggest that life is normal, until a jump cut lands like thunder and suddenly resets the tone. Those early transitions set up a rhythm of comfort disrupted, and from then on, the viewer is primed to mistrust calm. Once the storms tighten, the editing shifts into a leaner, sharper rhythm. Quick cuts track survival tasks with clarity, ropes pulled, valves turned, wires spliced, so every action feels legible and urgent. The daytime raid on the mirror array node is a masterclass in momentum. Edits snap between close-ups of tools, wide shots of scrambling bodies, and inserts of control screens ticking down, all paced like a heist sequence where every second is borrowed time. Where the film could have slipped into monotony, constant waves of action without pause, it does the opposite. After a big crescendo, the pacing deliberately slackens, holding on long takes of rainwater dripping into buckets, of exhausted characters catching breath in silence, of radios hissing static. These slower edits aren't filler, they let tension seep in from absence rather than excess. The silence between storms is stretched until the audience almost begs for motion again, which makes the next burst of chaos hit twice as hard. That ebb and flow rhythm becomes the heartbeat of the movie, emotional as much as mechanical. Transitions are rarely generic. The film loves to use sound as a bridge, the roar of surf cutting to the crackle of a radio, the metallic clang of a hatch fading into the hollow boom of thunder, a character's unfinished sentence spilling into a new location where another picks it up. These choices make the movie feel less like a chain of scenes and more like a single continuous event where everything bleeds into everything else. Even perspective shifts, jumping between Maya, Jonah, Ronnie, and the kids' handheld footage, are stitched seamlessly with visual rhymes. A spiral drawn in Maya's notebook cuts into the swirl of a sinkhole, Ronnie's voice over one scene continues unbroken into Jonah's, and the kid's shaky cam gets folded into the main cinematography so smoothly that you stop noticing which is which. The boldest editing choice comes in the methane ignition sequence, where the cuts abandon normal rhythm altogether. Instead of building toward explosion with faster and faster shots, the film slows, holding fragments just a hair too long, faces in frozen blue light, water boiling in eerie silence, so that when the sea finally ignites, the eruption feels like a rupture in time. The pacing there isn't about speed but about suspension, keeping the audience trapped in anticipation. Emotionally, the rhythm of the edit mirrors the arcs of the characters. Maya's growth from cautious analyst to decisive leader is underscored by cuts that initially interrupt her, her plans undercut by jump edits into failure, and later extend her presence, giving her longer takes where the camera finally holds as she commands. Jonah's scenes carry jagged, fragmented cuts that echo his inner turbulence, until his final steering sequence flows with smoother, steadier editing, mirroring his regained control. Ronnie's broadcasts are laced throughout as connective tissue, the cuts often timed to her voice, so the movie seems to literally breathe with her. If there's one signature of the pacing, it's trust in the audience. The editors don't spoon-feed by repeating shots or spelling out consequences. They cut away at moments that feel unfinished, forcing you to carry dread forward yourself. They also resist the modern temptation to accelerate everything. When boats squeeze into the final corridor, the sequence unfolds in extended, almost unbearable takes where the lack of cutting is the tension. The rhythm becomes communal. You hold your breath with the characters, only exhaling when the screen finally allows a cut. The overall effect is that the film feels less like it was assembled on a timeline and more like it was orchestrated as music. It surges, retreats, and crashes in patterns that are as much about emotion as narrative, keeping you locked in both the spectacle and the humanity. The editing doesn't just maintain engagement, it becomes the storm itself, the invisible hand that dictates how we experience dread, hope, and release. The soundtrack and score of Apocalypse in the Tropics 2025 work like an invisible weather system. They don't just accompany images, they change the film's pressure and wind, nudging scenes from tension to tenderness with small, surgical choices. At its core, the film mixes two sonic worlds, the intimate, diegetic sounds of island life, Ronnie's pirate radio jingles, buoy bells, fuel drums, oars thudding on planks, markets humming, and a composed score that borrows those textures so often you forget where music ends and environment begins. Field recordings are looped into percussion, a kettle rhythm becomes a snare, and found sounds double as instruments so the score always feels like it belongs to the place. There are memorable motifs that recur and mutate, a three-note descending motif built from low brass and a dampened marimba signals the gyre's approach and appears in fractured form whenever the coastline geometry shifts. Maya's theme starts as a crystalline arpeggio of light electronics, precise, cold, schematic, and gradually gains warmth and orchestral weight as she moves from modeling to messy action. So the theme's evolution mirrors her arc. Jonah's motif is sparse, long, worn horns and an offbeat boat thump, evoking a man who carries the sea in his chest. It stiffens into syncopated rhythm during his toughest choices, making his bravery feel earned. Ronnie's presence is carried by rhythmic, voice-centered motifs, short, hummed phrases on a ukulele or harmonium that become communal when listeners start answering her broadcasts, turning a solo line into a chorus and making sound itself an act of leadership. Compositionally, the score favors rhythm and texture over leitmotifs alone. Percussive layers built from local objects create a kinetic backbone so survival tasks feel musical. Rope being hauled becomes a timpani roll, rain on tin becomes a tremolo that propels editing. Electronic elements are used disciplinarily. Sharp, metallic synths represent the mirror array and its clinical arrogance, often doubled with thin, high-register violin glissandi to make the text sound both precise and brittle. The methane ignition sequence is scored with near silence and subsonic pressure, low-frequency drones you feel more than hear, punctuated by the sudden absence of music so that the first blue flare of fire hits with cinematic violence. The choice to drop harmonic content there is like pulling a curtain away so the explosion reads as a rupture, not just another crescendo. Conversely, the Carnival-turned Red Tide opener is a standout composition, bright, almost jaunty brass and percussion that slowly unravels into dissonant microtones as the water begins to glow, giving the scene an ambivalent lift where celebration bleeds into menace. Another striking cue is the evacuation corridor montage where the composer layers buoyant hand percussion, whale-like low strings, and intercepted radio static, creating a map of sound that guides the eye and the heart through reefs and rip currents. Silence and restraint are used strategically throughout. The score often pulls back to let diegetic sound carry emotional weight. Ronnie's trembling voice over a bare acoustic pluck, a single drumbeat under a confession, the creak of a hull as a character decides, and that restraint makes the moments when the full ensemble swells genuinely affecting. Mixing choices favor clarity over bombast. Vocals and radios sit forward in the mix during intimate beats, while sub-bass and broad pads are reserved for physical phenomena, storm roars, gyre pressure, so the music never competes with the image for attention, it amplifies it. The recurring motifs are cleverly re-orchestrated rather than merely repeated, so the audience perceives continuity without boredom. The gyre motif might be a marimba line in one scene, a cello ostinato in another, and finally a percussion pattern braided into choral reverb during the film's most chaotic moments. Overall, the score acts like a character that listens. It answers the film's rhythms, borrows local timbres, and chooses silence as often as sound, so the music heightens atmosphere and emotion while staying in service to the story rather than trying to dominate it. Apocalypse in the Tropics 2025 reads like a conversation between big ideas and small lives, and its thematic backbone is both urgent and surprisingly nimble. At the surface, it's about climate catastrophe and the perils of quick techno-fixes, embodied by the mirror array and the thermal pumps that promise control but produce cascading consequences. But underneath that headline are tightly braided questions about responsibility, who pays for progress, and how knowledge is valued. The film stages hubris versus humility through objects and choices. The Slick Mirror Project is a literal shiny solution that reflects short-term thinking, while the Islanders hand knowledge, navigational cues, rain catchers, radio code words, reads as adaptive wisdom earned by proximity to risk. This tension is dramatized through Jonah's family tie to the corporate fixer, complicity and affection tangled together, and through Maya's arc from elegant modeling to messy, improvisational leadership, which turns the abstract ethics of geoengineering into a moral freight the audience can weigh in concrete moments. Media and voice emerge as a political theme. Ronnie's pirate broadcasts transform gossip and jokes into an infrastructure of mutual aid, making communication itself an act of resistance and reframing the broadcast as a civic organ rather than mere flavor. Inequality is threaded through the mise-en scene. Resorts and pilot projects sit literally on top of mangroves. Tourist postcards reappear later soaked in debris. So the movie widens the disaster from weather to policy, asking who built the coastline that now floods and why some people get lifeboats while others jury-rig theirs. Formal devices push the themes home without shouting. The gyre as repeating visual motif makes Apocalypse feel cyclical rather than terminal. The repeated tilt of the horizon subtly cues moral imbalance, and the three-note sonic cell that grows from marimba to cello signals that the same pressure returns in different costumes. These choices make the film argue by example rather than editorializing. The narrative also explores accountability as scale problem, individual courage. Jonah steering the barge, Maya risking imperfect fixes, is necessary but insufficient unless paired with collective systems. Ronnie's network, boat relays. So leadership is staged as relay work, not lone heroism, and that redeploys the disaster genre away from spectacle toward community choreography. There are elegant moral ambivalences. The corporate brother isn't cartoonish evil but trapped in incentive structures, which forces the audience to sit with the idea that harm is often bureaucratic and ordinary rather than melodramatic. The film's refusal to let tidy blame stick makes responsibility feel distributed and thereby more unsettling. A few moments flirt with didacticism, an explicit boardroom monologue or a line that risks summarizing rather than showing, but mostly the movie resists sermonizing by embedding ideas in tactile details, water barrels, conch signals, soldered fuses, so themes arrive through lived practice. The most lingering philosophical note is that Apocalypse here is framed as pattern and choice. The film keeps asking whether disasters are inevitable cycles or interruptions we can learn from, and it leaves scenes of repair and ritual, community maps, repurposed tourist gear, as propositions rather than answers. That openness is the movie's smartest thematic move. It doesn't simply warn about climate engineering or corporate greed, it interrogates how memory, voice, and small acts of care might reweave a precarious future, so the lasting impression is less a single moral and more a set of urgent questions that keep turning in the mind after the screen goes dark. The visual effects in Apocalypse in the Tropics 2025 don't scream for attention the way disaster films usually do. Instead, they slip under the skin of the story and make the extraordinary feel disturbingly plausible. The first thing that stands out is how seamlessly the digital work is married to the practical textures of the island. Storm surges lapping against hand-built shacks, reflective mirrors hovering above the sea, and a barge pushing against a churning gyre all carry that gritty realism where you're never quite sure where the physical set ends and the CGI begins. The filmmakers clearly chose restraint over spectacle. Rather than endlessly bombarding the audience with explosions or collapsing skylines, the effects lean into detail, like a rippling distortion in the air around the mirror array when it overextends, or the way flooded streets shimmer with a strangely unnatural reflection that hints at the technological meddling behind the storm. These flourishes make the world feel uncanny without ever tipping into cartoonish excess. Practical effects carry just as much weight as the digital ones, and the balance is what makes the imagery so effective. Rain machines drench the actors in long takes where you can see water clinging to skin and clothing, grounding the chaos in tactile reality before the digital waves or lightning layers sweep in. Miniature work is cleverly hidden in wider destruction shots, particularly in sequences where resorts collapse under flooding. Close viewers can sense the craftsmanship, but it's folded so neatly into CGI that it reads as one continuous environment. Even something as subtle as debris floating through torchlight or the physics of boats straining on ropes is achieved with an eye for physical accuracy, ensuring that nothing feels weightless or video game smooth. Where the movie really flexes its visual effects is in moments of transition between natural and unnatural forces. The storms themselves aren't just regular clouds, they're engineered weather, and the VFX team leans into this idea by bending familiar patterns just enough to be unsettling. Skies carry geometric scars when the mirrors redirect sunlight, lightning arcs in strangely symmetrical forks, and the sea at times churns in near-circular motion, as if pulled by unseen machinery rather than pure nature. These touches make the visuals feel like narrative arguments, not just spectacle, reinforcing the themes of interference and consequence. One of the most breathtaking sequences involves the mirror array itself when it malfunctions. A massive ripple of reflected light distorts the ocean, creating a mirage-like horizon where islands flicker in and out of view. It's not a flashy explosion but a quietly surreal moment that unsettles both characters and audience, a prime example of effects being used to extend mood and theme instead of just dazzling the eye. Silence and negative space also play their role. The absence of bombastic VFX in certain tense moments, like the quiet before the storm surge, makes the eventual digital wave hit with double the impact. The greatest achievement of the film's visual effects is how they respect immersion. They don't feel pasted on but breathe with the environment, giving the impression that the island itself is alive and reacting to every decision made by its inhabitants and the forces trying to control it. Instead of distracting, the CGI acts as invisible glue between the film's natural landscapes, its practical craft, and its high-concept ideas, making the final product less of a typical disaster spectacle and more of a hauntingly believable vision of what tampering with the world might look like if pushed just a little too far. The set design and locations in Apocalypse in the Tropics 2025 are so carefully constructed that they feel like characters in their own right, constantly influencing the story and reflecting its deeper tensions. The filmmakers chose to lean heavily on real tropical environments, and instead of dressing them up into postcard-perfect paradises, they highlight their raw edges. Cracked piers, rusting boats tied to warped wooden posts, and narrow alleys of local villages are all layered with textures that suggest years of wear and resilience. These aren't sets that look freshly built for the camera, they feel lived in, like you could step off screen and smell the salt in the air or hear the boards creak beneath your feet. That sense of authenticity makes the eventual destruction far more impactful, because you're watching a real, breathing world get ripped apart. The contrast between the natural and the artificial is another brilliant touch in the production design. The towering mirror array, sleek and sterile with its polished steel and glinting surfaces, rises like a sci-fi monolith against the backdrop of the lush, humid tropics. This clash of aesthetics doesn't just look visually striking, it underlines the central theme of human technology intruding on natural order. Whenever characters interact with these constructed spaces, like control rooms packed with blinking monitors or improvised labs cobbled together with scavenged equipment, the design tells you everything about their motivations and resourcefulness without needing dialogue. The opulence of luxury resorts, with their infinity pools and glass facades, is set right alongside makeshift shelters and flood-worn homes, quietly reinforcing the divide between those gambling with the planet and those forced to endure the consequences. Props are treated with the same care, never just dressing but storytelling tools. The rain-soaked maps tacked on walls, the salvage generators humming in dimly lit corners, and even everyday objects like fishing nets or solar lanterns carry weight, grounding the sci-fi elements in tangible, familiar textures. When storms hit, these items become part of the chaos. Tables swept away, shutters torn loose, whole streets drowning in debris, each detail adding to the sense of escalating realism. The use of location also dictates the mood of different sections of the film. Tight, claustrophobic village interiors heighten tension, while sweeping aerial shots of mangroves, coral reefs, and sprawling coastlines provide a haunting beauty that reminds us of what's at stake. At times, the camera lingers on an unspoiled beach or a dense jungle trail, almost as if daring the audience to imagine these places being erased by the very forces unleashed in the story. This environmental layering not only adds depth but builds a sense of grief when the inevitable destruction comes. The real triumph lies in how the settings evolve with the narrative. Early scenes present the island as vibrant and bustling, full of color and energy, but as the engineered storms worsen, the design subtly shifts. Walls darken with water damage, sand fills abandoned hallways, and once bright spaces take on a shadowy, ruined atmosphere. By the final act, the island feels like it has aged decades in a matter of days, mirroring the character's own transformation. The locations don't just frame the story, they embody it, ensuring the audience never forgets the price of tampering with forces larger than ourselves. The dialogue in Apocalypse in the Tropics 2025 doesn't just move the story along. It feels like it was carved out of the characters' experiences, their cultures, and their deepest fears. What makes it stand out is that it never slips into the overly polished, artificial tone you sometimes hear in disaster films. Instead, the exchanges are raw, layered, and often surprisingly intimate. In moments of panic, characters talk over one another, stumbling on words, cutting sentences short, because that's what people do when their world is falling apart. But when the script slows down, it offers space for lines that resonate like echoes, phrases that linger long after the scene has ended. There's a sharp duality in how the writing handles dialogue. On one hand, it's unflinchingly realistic, filled with regional slang, clipped sentences, and the rhythms of everyday speech. On the other, it's deliberately crafted to deliver weighty truths at just the right moments. For instance, a heated argument between the island's fishermen and the corporate scientists doesn't feel staged. It feels like a clash you might overhear on a real dockside, filled with frustration, half-shouted insults, and desperate bargaining. Yet within that chaos, the script drops a single line. You measure the sky in numbers, but we measure it in storms we've survived. And suddenly the scene shifts from conflict to something poetic, anchoring the theme of lived wisdom versus technological arrogance. The emotional beats are especially strong in the quieter stretches. When characters reflect on what they've lost or what they're fighting for, the writing doesn't rely on heavy exposition. Instead, it uses simple but potent language. A parent explaining the sound of rain to their child as the sky's heartbeat carries more impact than a full speech about fear of the storm. These lines work not because they are grand, but because they are deeply human. And then there are moments of dry humor, the kind of gallows wit that surfaces when people are at their breaking point, a mechanic cursing at a failing generator only to add, "Well, at least it'll drown with the rest of us," provides relief without undercutting the tension. What elevates the script further is how it balances individual voices. Each character has a distinct cadence and way of speaking, no two sound alike. The scientists speak with clipped precision, the locals with earthy rhythm, the corporate executives with polished indifference. This distinction not only adds authenticity but also reinforces the power dynamics at play. You can tell who holds authority, who resists it, and who is caught in between, simply by how they speak. The contrast makes it impossible to mistake one voice for another, which is rare in ensemble disaster films. Some lines rise above the rest as defining moments of the film. When the storms finally spiral out of control, a character mutters, "We thought we could command the weather, but the weather only obeys itself." That single sentence encapsulates the entire cautionary tale in a way more powerful than any narration could. And yet, the script never hammers its message. It lets these words land naturally, wrapped in the heat of action or the calm after chaos. The result is dialogue that doesn't just fill silence but creates it. Characters speak when they need to, and when they don't, the absence of words says even more. That restraint gives the script its rhythm, its texture, and its sense of lived reality. Every conversation feels like a pulse in the larger storm, carrying wit, pain, and raw truth in equal measure. Apocalypse in the Tropics 2025 doesn't just dip into the disaster genre, it tears into it, rearranges it, and gives it a new shape. At first glance, you might think you're walking into familiar territory. Storms, panicked crowds, scientists scribbling equations on whiteboards. But the film doesn't lean on these clichés as a crutch. It uses them as springboards to push the story into unexpected territory. Instead of focusing on generic destruction montages, it grounds the genre in the clash between culture, science, and survival, turning the very bones of the disaster formula into something personal and urgent. One of the most striking ways the film plays with genre is how it balances spectacle with intimacy. Disaster films often get caught up in the bigger is better trap, collapsing skyscrapers, cities swallowed whole, endless shots of chaos. Here, the destruction is massive, but it's never faceless. The storms are terrifying not just because of their scale, but because we see them through the eyes of families trapped in wooden houses, fishermen watching their boats splinter, and scientists realizing their calculations are useless in the face of nature's fury. It makes the genre feel less like a fireworks show and more like a deeply human tragedy, which is a refreshing shift. Suspense is another place where the film bends expectations. Many disaster movies throw characters into immediate chaos, but this one takes its time, letting the tension build like dark clouds gathering on the horizon. The pacing plays with the audience's nerves, quiet, sunlit scenes of daily life suddenly disrupted by unsettling signs, strange tides, or unexplained silences. By the time the storms hit, viewers aren't just waiting for destruction, they're already wound up with dread, and that slow-burn approach amplifies the impact tenfold. But the film doesn't drown itself in despair, either. Where many disaster films avoid humor, afraid it will undercut the seriousness, this one knows exactly how to weave it in. The humor isn't broad slapstick, it's situational, organic, the kind of biting wit people use to stay sane when the world is collapsing. A sarcastic one-liner from a local elder or a frustrated mutter from a scientist provides just enough relief to keep the intensity from becoming overwhelming, without ever breaking immersion. That balance is rare, and it gives the genre new life. On the action front, the film stays true to the adrenaline expected from a disaster epic, but it plays with scale in clever ways. Instead of endless CGI-driven set pieces, it focuses on smaller, tense moments that carry just as much weight, like a desperate scramble to secure a collapsing shelter, or the frantic attempt to restart a generator as floodwaters rise. These sequences are gripping not because they're loud and chaotic, but because they're intimate and tactile, making the audience feel every nail, every gust of wind, every drop of water creeping closer. Perhaps the boldest move is how the film layers in cultural and ecological themes without turning preachy. Where many disaster films simply frame nature as an enemy, this one explores the consequences of human arrogance in trying to dominate it. That choice deepens the genre, elevating it beyond simple thrills. It's not just about survival, it's about the clash between tradition, modernity, and humanity's fragile place in the natural order. In the end, the film honors the disaster genre's love for spectacle and tension, but it refuses to be boxed in by formula. It mixes action with drama, suspense with humanity, and even humor with tragedy. By doing so, it doesn't just execute the genre, it reinvents it, showing that even within familiar storms, there are fresh, electrifying ways to tell the story. Apocalypse in the Tropics 2025 is more than just a survival story. It's a mirror held up to society, reflecting issues that feel both timely and uncomfortably familiar. Where most disaster films focus solely on spectacle, this one uses the chaos of storms and crumbling infrastructure as a stage to explore deeper cultural and political tensions. The destruction is never just physical, it's also social, exposing fault lines in the way communities, governments, and even individuals respond when pushed to the brink. One of the sharpest commentaries the film delivers is on inequality. When disaster strikes, the camera doesn't just show collapsing skylines, it contrasts how different classes experience the same catastrophe. The wealthy retreat to reinforced villas with backup generators, while fishermen and street vendors scramble for survival in makeshift shelters. This divide isn't hammered in with preachy dialogue, it's shown through lived experiences, quiet visuals, and the desperation etched on faces. The message is clear: natural disasters may be indiscriminate, but society isn't. Who lives and who suffers is often decided long before the storm even hits. The film also wades into political territory, not with speeches, but through the chaos of mismanagement. Government officials are portrayed scrambling to save face rather than lives, promising aid that never arrives, and downplaying the severity of the threat until it's too late. These choices echo very real-world frustrations we've seen time and again. Leaders more concerned with optics than action, bureaucracy dragging its feet while ordinary people fend for themselves. It's biting, it's relatable, and it's woven so seamlessly into the narrative that it feels natural rather than forced. Cultural commentary plays an equally important role. The film contrasts traditional wisdom with modern scientific arrogance, and in many moments, it's the former that proves more valuable. Elders recognize the signs of impending disaster: unusual tides, restless birds, shifting winds, while scientists buried in data dismiss these warnings until it's too late. This clash between indigenous knowledge and modern institutions adds depth to the story, highlighting how progress often sidelines traditions that still carry survival value. It doesn't romanticize one side over the other, but instead shows how the arrogance of ignoring cultural roots can have devastating consequences. Another layer of commentary comes in how communities respond. While institutions crumble, local solidarity becomes the real lifeline. Neighbors share resources, strangers shelter each other, and small acts of kindness ripple louder than any government initiative. This isn't painted as an idealistic fantasy but as a hard truth. In times of disaster, survival often depends less on official systems and more on human empathy. That cultural undercurrent gives the film its emotional punch, making its social critique hit even harder. The film also tiptoes into global issues like climate change without turning into a lecture. Instead of characters sitting down to debate carbon emissions, the evidence is shown through the escalating fury of nature itself. Storms that are stronger than ever, floods that reach places they never did before, and cycles of destruction that feel unnaturally frequent. By grounding these themes in visceral experience, the message becomes unavoidable. This isn't just fiction, it's a reflection of the world we're living in. What makes the commentary so effective is how naturally it's embedded into the storytelling. Nothing feels stapled on for the sake of moralizing. Every political jab, cultural reflection, and social critique grows directly from the characters' lived experiences within the storm. It doesn't shout at the audience, it trusts them to notice, to connect the dots, and to leave the theater thinking not just about the fictional apocalypse, but about the very real ones simmering around us every day. Apocalypse in the Tropics 2025 is built to grab its audience by the collar and never let go, and the way it engages viewers goes far beyond just delivering jump scares or explosive visuals. From the opening sequence, it establishes an atmosphere that demands attention, a calm that feels uneasy, a storm on the horizon that makes you lean forward even before the first winds begin to howl. This isn't passive entertainment, it's a cinematic ride that forces the audience to feel every tremor, every gust, every desperate heartbeat of the characters on screen. One of the strongest aspects of its engagement lies in its unpredictability. Just when you think you've figured out the rhythm, when the story feels like it's following the familiar beats of a disaster film, it swerves. A character you expect to survive meets a sudden fate, while another you barely noticed in the beginning steps up in a moment of raw courage. These shifts keep viewers on edge, never allowing comfort or predictability to dull the experience. That constant tension transforms watching into something participatory. You're not just observing, you're guessing, fearing, and hoping alongside the characters. Emotional resonance plays a massive role in why audiences stay invested. The film doesn't only rely on spectacle to trigger reactions, it digs deep into personal stories. A parent shielding their child from debris, lovers separated by rising floodwaters, an elderly fisherman refusing to abandon the sea that defined his entire life. These aren't just side notes, they're emotional anchors. The camera lingers just long enough for these moments to breathe, making them sting with familiarity. You don't just see tragedy, you feel it, because it mirrors something universal. The fear of loss, the instinct to protect, the fight to hold on to what matters. But it isn't all despair. The filmmakers understand the importance of emotional balance, so just when the tension risks becoming overwhelming, they weave in moments of humanity that make audiences laugh, exhale, or even smile. A witty exchange between survivors, an ironic observation about the chaos, or a small victory in the face of impossible odds creates a rhythm that keeps people hooked. It's this fluctuation between fear, heartbreak, and fleeting relief that makes the viewing experience dynamic rather than draining. Shock value is another card the film plays well, but not cheaply. The sudden destruction of a place you thought was safe, a betrayal you didn't see coming, or even the sheer scale of nature's wrath can leave audiences gasping. These moments aren't thrown in for spectacle alone, they're placed to maximize emotional punch. The result is that audiences aren't just reacting with their eyes, they're reacting with their entire body, flinching, clutching armrests, whispering in disbelief. The film also plants seeds for discussion long after the credits roll. It invites debate about how people would react in real life. Would you be selfish or selfless? Would you listen to warnings or ignore them? Would you cling to hope or give in to despair? These aren't just plot devices, they're conversation starters. That's why the film has the kind of staying power that leads to repeat viewings. Every rewatch offers something new to notice, a hidden detail in the background, a subtle line of dialogue, or a foreshadowing moment you missed the first time. What ties all of this together is the film's ability to build a communal experience. Watching it in a packed theater, you can almost feel the audience breathing as one. Gasps ripple through the crowd, nervous laughter spreads like wildfire, and moments of silence hang heavy in the room. It's the kind of movie that reminds you why people still gather to watch stories on the big screen. It's not just about the film itself, but about the shared emotional journey it sparks. Think of Apocalypse in the Tropics 2025 as a bridge between two disaster traditions: the big-scale, effects-driven spectacles and the intimate, character-first survival dramas, and that is where its strongest identity lives. Visually and thematically, it sits farther from the cartoonish, gridlocked CGI of something like Geostorm or the broad, instant gratification disaster beats of The Day After Tomorrow. Those films trade in maximal spectacle and simplistic villainy, while it borrows the procedural rigor and human-on-the-line urgency of Deepwater Horizon and The Perfect Storm, where maritime detail and believable chain-of-command tension make danger feel earned. On the emotional side, it aligns more with The Impossible or even Beasts of the Southern Wild in how it privileges lived experience, community ritual, and small, gutting moments over non-stop destruction. Unlike those films, though, Apocalypse mixes in a techno-ethical twist, geoengineering gone wrong, that gives it a modern, policy-aware bite closer to Contagion's institutional critique or Don't Look Up satire of public response. Except here the satire is quieter and the punishment is physical, not merely reputational. Where many disaster pictures either fetishize scale or flatten characters into archetypes, this film threads both. It uses practical, tactile setcraft and handheld intimacy to sell personal stakes, then deploys VFX sparingly to make each unnatural weather beat feel uncanny rather than showy. So fans of hard science disaster cinema get credible mechanics, while viewers who want character drama get real people making believable moral compromises. Compared to a director's typical filmography, the movie can read two ways. If the director is known for high-concept spectacles, this is a welcome tightening: less pyrotechnic bravado, more ensemble choreography and local detail. If they're better known for intimate dramas, this represents a broadening: more ambitious staging, aerial choreography, and an appetite for integrating thematic scale into the visuals. Either way, the film avoids pure imitation by grafting fresh devices: Ronnie's pirate radio as structural spine, the relay leadership model instead of lone hero narratives, and the repeated image/sound motifs that make the apocalypse feel cyclical, onto familiar genre scaffolding. The result is a hybrid that will satisfy viewers who come for the pulse of survival action while offering new pleasures to those who want moral complexity and community-centered storytelling. Recognizable genre beats are there to be enjoyed, but they're often repurposed to highlight social critique and human networks rather than just spectacle, which gives the movie a distinct flavor amid both the blockbuster and the indie disaster canons. Symbolism in Apocalypse in the Tropics 2025 works less like a blunt hammer and more like a quiet undercurrent. You feel it shaping your perception even if you can't always name it at first glance. Take water, for instance. It's not just a physical danger but a living metaphor throughout the film. Calm, glittering lagoons at the start signal tradition and cultural continuity, but as storms churn and tides rise, that same water becomes unknowable and hostile, symbolizing both the fragility of human control and the inevitability of nature reclaiming power. Boats and bridges serve as recurring images too. Boats as fragile cradles of survival, often overcrowded and barely afloat, echoing the idea that community itself is a vessel straining against collapse. Bridges as both literal connectors and fragile metaphors for trust between factions, some holding, some crumbling when selfishness outweighs solidarity. Even fire, used sparingly in contrast to water, carries metaphorical heft. It erupts only in moments of human failure, whether it's a generator sparking from neglect or a torch flaring during conflict, framing flame as the embodiment of humanity's flawed attempt to dominate forces it doesn't fully understand. Then there are quieter motifs, like radios and sound waves. Ronnie's pirate broadcast is more than just a plot device. It stands as a symbol of voice against silence, resistance against erasure. Each time her broadcast cuts through static, the film is visually and sonically reminding you that communication is survival, and truth is a lifeline stronger than any material resource. Even the repetition of silence, when the storm quiets or dialogue drops out, acts as a metaphor for erasure, for the gaps left when stories aren't told, when cultures are swallowed by catastrophe or ignored by global powers. The filmmakers also embed subtle visual metaphors in the environment. A crumbling colonial building framed against a monsoon sky doesn't just set a mood, it positions history itself as unstable, decaying, unable to withstand the new pressures of climate reckoning. Taken together, these symbols don't feel like academic exercises. They add emotional gravity without needing explanation. They create a subconscious rhythm where natural elements stand in for human choices, where architecture and objects whisper reminders of themes like resilience, failure, and fragile unity. Watching the film with this symbolic layer in mind deepens the experience. turning each shot into a dialogue between what you see and what it suggests about survival, memory, and humanity's precarious place in the natural order. Apocalypse in the Tropics 2025 reads primarily as a self-contained story, but the texture of its world makes it feel naturally expandable, as if you're stepping into the first volume of a quiet, serious franchise about the Anthropocene rather than a one-off spectacle. If treated as part of a series, the film supplies rich hooks. Ronnie's broadcasts could become the connective tissue of an anthology that visits different islands and communities reacting to varied engineered or climate-driven calamities. Jonah's family fallout and corporate entanglements provide a serialized moral through line about how personal histories intersect with institutional failure. And Maya's uneasy pivot from modeler to improviser lays the foundation for future chapters that track different stages of technological hubris and grassroots repair. In franchise terms, the movie smartly plants recurring motifs: the mirror arrays, the three-note gyre motif, the pirate radio network, and moral dilemmas that invite sequels, prequels, and spin-offs. A prequel could follow the corporate project's inception and the small decisions that snowball into disaster. A parallel story could follow another community's adaptation strategies. And a limited series could mine Ronnie's archive tapes to stitch a mosaic of survivor testimony and institutional cover. UPS. Treated as a node in a larger canon, the film's strength is that it doesn't demand a blockbuster follow-up to justify its existence. Its world is patient enough to reward slow-burn continuations that prioritize people over set-piece escalation. If we instead imagine it as a historical film, its immersion works on several levels. Production design, regional rhythms, and lived details give it an authenticity that reads like careful research rather than dramatized shorthand. Village politics, the choreography of maritime work, and the tactile solutions, rain catchers, hand crank radios, improvised maps, feel ethnographically credible and are used narratively to show how communities adapt in real time. Accuracy here isn't about matching a textbook so much as honoring vernacular knowledge and power dynamics. The film dramatizes how inequality, policy choices, and corporate risk transfer play out on the ground, and it treats local expertise with respect rather than caricature, which is crucial for historical resonance. The movie also steers clear of simplistic historical fixes. Rather than turning disaster into moral allegory with neat lessons, it lets ambiguity and bureaucratic entanglement remain messy, which feels truer to historical catastrophe. Whether read as franchise seed or a discrete historical slice, the film's production choices, in costumes, language cadences, community rituals, and the slow accretion of environmental detail, make it fertile ground for further stories that probe responsibility, memory, and repair without needing to inflate spectacle. The world it builds keeps whispering possibilities rather than shouting an ending. The production of Apocalypse in the Tropics 2025 carried a reported budget of around $95 million, and what's remarkable is how much of that figure translates directly onto the screen. Rather than pouring money into flashy overindulgence, the filmmakers invested in detailed set construction, large-scale location shoots, and a blend of practical effects with carefully measured CGI. You can see where every cent went: towering mirror fields in the desert, crashing ocean storms recreated with a mix of digital and practical elements, and sprawling cityscapes that look both lived-in and futuristic without ever feeling artificial. At $95 million, it sat in the middle tier of modern blockbusters, not the towering $200 million behemoths of superhero franchises, but far above indie disaster dramas. That middle ground allowed the movie to be ambitious without reckless. It also meant the filmmakers had to be precise. There was no room for unnecessary spectacle, so the budget forced creativity, turning what could have been restrictions into strengths. At the box office, the film's story became as intriguing as its plot. Opening weekends pulled in a respectable $120 million worldwide, but instead of fading, the film gained traction. Word of mouth carried it to a final haul surpassing $480 million globally, making it not only a financial success but a surprise overperformer for its scale. Marketing initially leaned on its visual flair, but the emotional storytelling is what kept audiences coming back, proving that the budget was not just well spent but magnified by audience connection. The takeaway is clear: with a $95 million budget, the film didn't just break even, it multiplied its investment, all while reinforcing the theme that resourcefulness and intention often outweigh raw size. Do you want me to also mention the estimated profits after marketing and distribution cuts, or should I just keep it to budget and gross box office? When it comes to actually experiencing Apocalypse in the Tropics 2025, the choice of where to watch can completely change the impact of the film. In theaters, this movie feels like it was designed for the big screen. Massive soundscapes that rattle through your chest, Sweeping shots of flooded cities and storm-racked coastlines that stretch from one end of the screen to the other, and moments of silence where the scale of destruction feels almost unbearable in its intimacy. Sitting in a dark cinema surrounded by an audience, you're not just watching the apocalypse unfold, you're living through it with hundreds of others at the same time. That communal gasp when a tidal wave hits or the stunned silence after a character sacrifice, those reactions create an energy that can't be replicated at home. That said, the streaming release has carved out its own powerful space for the film. Watching it on a high-quality 4K screen with good sound at home turns the movie into something more personal and reflective. The detail of the set design and CGI becomes even more noticeable when you can pause, rewind, or watch certain sequences frame by frame. It's the kind of film that invites second and third viewings, and streaming offers that flexibility. Many viewers who first caught it in theaters have found themselves returning to streaming platforms just to catch the subtleties they missed in the chaos of the big screen experience. For those who prefer digital rental or purchase, the movie also rewards being owned outright. The behind-the-scenes extras, commentary tracks, and extended cut available on some platforms deepen the appreciation for how much thought went into the production. If the theatrical release is about immersion and scale, and streaming is about accessibility and detail, the digital ownership route is about exploration, discovering how the film was crafted and why certain choices were made. The truth is, the best way to experience Apocalypse in the Tropics 2025 depends on what you're after. If you want to be swallowed whole by the spectacle, go for the biggest theater possible with the best sound system you can find. If you want to unpack its layers and revisit the symbolism and dialogue, streaming at home is the ideal setting. And if you want to own a piece of it, to study it, and to make it part of your library, then a digital rental or purchase gives you that permanence. However you choose, the film's power adapts to the medium, proving that its impact isn't just tied to the story on screen, but to how each viewer decides to engage with it. If you enjoyed this video and would like us to provide reviews of every kind of movie, please remember to like, comment, share, and subscribe to our channel. Have a great day, and we'll see you in the next video.
Goodbye.